Will the tribulation begin this October 2nd on the Feast of Trumpets? Will man's final 7-year reign commence with the Daniel 9:27 covenant? Will it be marked by a final solar eclipse in the series of 4 that started back in 2017? Will the white horseman ride as the eclipse warns the nations? I bet you forgot about all these solar eclipses. Nearly everybody was super excited about the April 8th eclipse because it was over the USA, and many were worried that it was going to be the end of the world. It was the most anticipated solar eclipse in history. Emergencies were declared in states all along the path, and National Guardsmen were called out to control the crowds. Nobody is talking about this one that's happening on the Feast of Trumpets, exactly 6 biblical months to the day later, even though prophetically it is likely the most significant of all the eclipses. It's the final warning in this series of 4. Now, the astute among you are probably saying, hey, wait a minute. The Feast of Trumpets begins with the sighting of the first sliver of a new moon at night. Solar eclipse, that's going to happen during the day, and you'd be right on both counts. But the sighting of the new moon in Israel happens when it's daylight halfway around the world where this eclipse is going to take place. Ooh, I hear a lot of you saying. In fact, the eclipse will begin at sundown in Jerusalem as the new moon is fully dark, and the eclipse will continue for 6 hours, so the moment the sliver of the new moon forms will likely be during the eclipse. Others are saying, hey, wait, the beginning of a tribulation is marked by a covenant with the many, the one in Daniel 9:27, and maybe the ride of the white horseman, but not a solar eclipse. Those are the 2 biblical signs, you're correct. But eclipses can fall on that date as well, and it would certainly make it more auspicious and symbolic, as we're going to explain today. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters. So will the tribulation, obviously the greatest prophetic event in any of our lifetimes up to this point, will it actually begin in a couple weeks? Today we're going to give you what to watch for so you know if it did begin. Because if it does, many things are about to change. Our lives will change forever. That makes this a super important video. You can start right now going down below the video, hitting the share button and sending it out as far and wide as you can. Now, the first thing we got to look for, knowing if this is the tribulation, is the day. The Feast of Trumpets. The tribulation must begin on a Feast of Trumpets, whether it is this year or whether it's another year. The tribulation can't just begin on a random day of the year. It must begin on the secular New Year, which marks the beginning of the agricultural cycle in Israel. The tribulation is also known as Daniel's 70th week, and our understanding of it comes from the 70 weeks prophecy found in Daniel 9:24 through 27. The angel Gabriel gave Daniel a prophecy that 70 weeks of years were prophesied for his people and the holy city Jerusalem. These weeks of years, or Shabuim, governed the agricultural cycles in Israel. 6 years of sowing and reaping, and then 1 year when the ground would remain fallow. 6 years of work and 1 year of rest. Just like a week of days, 6 days of work and a Sabbath rest. These cycles always started in the fall with the Feast of Trumpets. Today, we know this day as Rosh Hashanah, or Rosh Hashanah to some. And most of us know the final 7 years, the final week of years, the final Shabuah, has a covenant that lasts that entire period, the covenant with the many. And he shall make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week, Daniel 9:27, and that's a week of years. Most also believe the white horseman rides upon the signing of this covenant. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Revelation 6:1-2. These are the primary two scriptures that mark the tribulation. And shockingly to most, these events will likely be fulfilled not only in our lifetime, but this fall as part of the United Nations Summit for the Future, what the UN itself is calling the most important gathering of a generation, maybe of many generations. Their plan is to come out of the summit with a covenant called the Pact for the Future that will, in essence, grant the UN emergency powers over all the nations anytime the UN deems it necessary. This would form a system, essentially, of global governance. What will be one of their first acts? Probably to impose a peace covenant on the Middle East, and maybe divide Israel in a two-state solution. We're surmising, but if this is the covenant with the many, that's likely what will happen. This is symbolically shown in the Bible as the rider on a white horse, the first seal of Revelation. White is a color of false peace, as in Ezekiel 13:10, precisely because they have misled my people, saying peace when there is no peace, and because the people build a wall. These prophets smear it with whitewash. The crown the rider wears is a Stephanos olive leaf crown, kind of like a headband. That also symbolizes peace. It's the symbol of the United Nations, by the way. A bow without arrows also symbolizes peace. And not just any peace, but a peace covenant. The first time the word bow is used in the Bible is found in Genesis 9, where God used it to make a covenant with Noah. After the flood, he laid his battle bow down in the sky as a sign of that covenant. Yes, we call that a rainbow today, but the word in Genesis in Hebrew is specifically bow, like the bow of the white horseman. And finally, the UN plans to go out conquering and to conquer with a covenant, with this covenant bow, not with war, to conquer the world with false peace. Okay, so you know what to look for. A covenant or pact for the future coming out of the UN. Now, one thing to know is the way the Bible talks about time. Yes, a covenant might happen exactly on October 2nd. Or it may actually take 1, 2, or 3 months to be finalized. We in our Western society are very precise about exact days and exact times. A year, after all, is 365 days, right? Well, in Bible times, unless they were specific about it, a year was a more generalized time. It meant that this would happen during the year. So if you don't see a covenant exactly on October 2nd, that doesn't mean that the tribulation hasn't started. However, I would say if we don't see a covenant by springtime, you can be pretty sure it didn't start. Now, how does this eclipse fit into the symbolism of what's happening? There have been 3 eclipses in this pattern, 3 in the USA, and then this 4th one on October 2nd. All of them have been related to the dividing of the land of Israel, the two-state solution. The first 3 involved meetings between the USA State Department and Mohammed bin Salman to craft the two-state solution. That's why the first 3 eclipses were all over the USA, as a warning to that country not to do this horrible thing. The next eclipse is not over the USA, and we'll explain where it is and why the symbolism of this is absolutely perfect. But first, you may ask, does God use the sun and moon for signs? Can signs in the sky be anything other than astrology, which is forbidden by God? The answer to that is pretty clear. Yes, God does use signs in the sky, and he has told us that. In the very first chapter of the Bible, in Genesis 1:14, we read, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years." In regard to the end times, the Gospel of Luke says this in Luke 21:25, "And there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth distress among nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves. So God definitely uses the sun, moon, and stars for signs. So an eclipse, in the end times especially, can be a sign. Now, not every eclipse, but some definitely have been, as you're about to see in a second. Now, in terms of eclipses, did you know they likely only occur on the earth and nowhere else in the universe? The reason is that the ratio of the size of the sun to the size of the moon is exactly proportional to the ratio of the distance of the sun and the moon to the earth. Sounds kind of scientific, doesn't it? But this allows a smaller object, the moon, to completely and exactly block out a much larger object, the sun, during an eclipse. The only planet where this ratio is like this in the whole universe is the earth. This is definitely a God thing. He created them that way, not solely some natural phenomenon. It's a God thing by precise design. This verse also says God uses the sun and moon for seasons, which in Hebrew is the term moedim, or appointed times. There are 7 of these feasts of the Lord appointed by God each year, and the Feast of Trumpets that we've been talking about is one of them. They have prophetic importance, like the Apostle Paul says in Colossians 2, 16 through 17. Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food or drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of things to come. In other words, these feasts of the Lord and festivals have prophetic importance in the future. And as Paul says, no one should pass judgment on you because you try and understand these things. New moons are also important for determining the start of years. In the Hebrew calendar, there are 2 years running simultaneously, 6 months apart, a religious year that starts in the spring on Nisan 1, which this year happened to coincide with that famous eclipse of April 8th, and the agricultural civic year that begins 6 months later on Tishri 1, the Feast of Trumpets. And this year, solar eclipses happen on both of these days. Interesting, isn't it? This year, both Hebraic years start with an eclipse, which is quite rare. So the Bible definitely supports biblical prophetic events happening on new moons and on feasts of the Lord. And it supports God using these things as signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Now, next month's eclipse is the 4th in a series of eclipses that started 7 years ago. The first 3 eclipses took place over the USA, as we said. In combination, the paths of these solar eclipses form the shape of the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Tav, back in the Paleo-Hebrew script, the ancient script from the days of King David. Now, those Hebrew letters are the equivalent of the Alpha and Omega in Greek. Jesus said he is the Alpha and Omega, so in a way, Jesus signed his name to this set of eclipses. What are the odds of that? Much more rare than the dates, in my opinion. And something only this channel has reported on, and I think we can thank Fisherman for this information. On the day after the eclipses in the USA in 2017 and 2023, and somewhat in 2024, we have a video on that subject. We'll put a link in the description. The USA's Secretary of State or his representatives met with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to discuss the two-state solution. This is more than just a coincidence, folks. The odds of eclipses and meetings like this taking place at the same time is strictly astronomical. It has now left the area of coincidence, and it is strictly in the area of a sign. It cannot be random chance. And since we know from Joel 3:2 that Jesus judges the nations upon his return for doing just that, dividing the land of Israel, what the two-state solution is all about. So, were these eclipses a warning to the USA and Saudi Arabia not to move forward with this horrible thing, with what God hates and will judge? It appears so. This brings us to the 4th eclipse on the Feast of Trumpets, the final day of the UN Summit for the Future. The previous 3 times the eclipses took place over the USA, which was appropriate since they were driving the process to divide the land of Israel. God appeared to be warning them via these eclipses not to do it. This time, the eclipse is taking place over the Pacific Ocean. To which many of you are probably laughing right now, saying, Nelson, what do you think? God is going to judge the oceans? Is he warning the oceans? No, not at this time. He's warning the nations. Remember in Revelation 17:15, how God symbolically represents the nations and peoples of the earth. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. So many waters, the many waters that Mystery Babylon is seated on, are a multitude of nations, United Nations. God is symbolically warning the United Nations not to do this thing, not to make the covenant with the many and launch the tribulation, not to divide the land of Israel. This day may also launch the formation of Mystery Babylon, at least the empowerment of Mystery Babylon from Revelation 17 and 18. So many of you have different views on Mystery Babylon. We know that. Some think it's Rome, some think it's the USA, some Europe, some Saudi Arabia, some Jerusalem. Well, if it's forming or at least being empowered right now, within weeks, it's time we discuss this again in depth to learn who the Bible says Mystery Babylon is and how this UN covenant will empower it. Click right here. If that video is not released yet, click over here to learn who it is, who the Prince of the Covenant is, who makes the covenant with the many, as we're told in the book of Daniel. Here's a hint. It's not who your pastor has told you it is. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.